Hello everyone. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over my complete process into modeling this table and chairs. All right, starting off in Maya, what we're going to want to do first is come up here to create free image plane. An image plane allows you to import a reference image into Maya, and we're going to use this reference image to model off of. So from here, you want to open up the attribute editor. The shortcut for the attribute editor is Control A. And you can also find it on the right hand side like so. Make sure you do have this image plane selected. Then you can come down here to image name, click the little folder, and I'm actually going to copy and paste. I already have the path to this image right here and hit open. And just like that, we can now see this image inside of Maya. Now I have gone ahead and looked up the average height of a dining room table. And in this case, a dining room table on average is about 30 inches high. So what I want to do is I'm actually going to change the preferences of Maya right now. Just to change these grid measurements to be in inches. So you open up the preferences down here by clicking the little man running away from a gear, come over here to settings, and let's just change this to inches. What I'm going to do is come up here to create polygon primitive and cube. And now all I have to do is if I scale this up, I can actually scale this into Y by 30, and that is going to be 30 inches. I also want to make sure that the geometry and the image plane is on the ground level. If I come over here to the perspective view, this grid right here is the ground. So notice how this is actually halfway through the ground. In order to fix that, I'm going to hit D on the keyboard. D lets you move the pivot, and then I'm actually going to hold V, and V is going to allow me to snap it down to the bottom. Notice how it's actually letting me snap it by points. So if I drag it to the top, it snaps up there. If I drag it to the bottom, it snaps like so. And you can see right up here, these are the different snapping settings. So every time I hit V on the keyboard, notice how that one highlights. I can snap to the grid as well. So notice how this little icon is a grid, and I can hit D, which gets me out of the pivot mode. And now notice how this begins snapping to all these different increments of the grid. So what I'm going to do is make sure it snaps to that center point, and I can turn that off. Notice if I go back to this view, now it is actually on the ground. Now I'm using this geometry right here so that I can better scale this image. I'm going to do the same exact thing by selecting this image plane, hitting D, and for now I'm just going to move this pivot point right to about like so. I'm also going to go ahead and use X-ray mode, a little button right here. This allows me to see through the geometry, and I can also turn on wireframe if I like, just so I can see the geometry a little bit better. But from here, now I can just scale up this image, and I'm just scaling up to match about the height of that leg. So notice how the very top is right about there. And this should allow me to be as accurate as possible to get to a real world scale for this table. I'll also go ahead and translate this image back a little bit. I can go ahead and punch in an actual number, so maybe like -100. Doesn't necessarily matter how far back it goes. Notice how this image doesn't change whatsoever. And the last thing I want to do with this image plane, with the image plane selected, come over here to the bottom right. I'm going to click this little icon over here. It says create new layer. I'm going to click that. I'm going to double click this name. I'm going to go ahead and rename this to image plane display layer. Oh, and actually you can't have any spaces. So I'm just going to put underscores. And I'm going to just double click this button right here. So 1 and then 2. And what this does is it changes this image plane to a reference. So now you can notice when I actually try to click and drag, it doesn't actually let me select the image plane, which is exactly what I want. This is going to help me be able to model without accidentally messing up the image plane. If you do need to select the image plane, you can easily just come up here to the outliner. You can select it this way. So now that we have this proper height, we can actually begin to scale this leg accordingly. This image is in a slight perspective, so it's not going to be perfect. If I want, I can actually drag this a little bit more over. I'm trying to get this geometry perfectly centered. And there are two different ways you can actually scale this leg. The way that I prefer is in this view. Normally, if you grab this little green scale and go up and down, it's going to scale just as expected. expected. And let me actually, so you can better see this, I'm going to change this view into a 2-panel layout. So I'm going to click over here on the left, go to 2 panels. And what I'm making sure is I have a perspective camera and this front camera. If any of these are not that, you can come down here to panels and you can change it. So notice how I can change this to be orthographic top. And now this is the top camera and the perspective, but I'm going to go ahead and stick to front and perspective. Normally, if you just grab this little scale manipulator, it scales up and down. However, if you hold Control and click it, it actually will start scaling in the opposite 2 directions. So notice how now it is getting wider. So I'm just going to go ahead and scale that up, trying to get about this width of the leg. So maybe a tiny bit less. And it does look like the top of the leg is a little bit wider than the bottom. What I can do is I'm going to go ahead and start adding some edge loops first, and then I'm going to start scaling to get a little bit more closer. Shift right click, I'm going to use the insert edge loop tool, and I'm going to open up the dialog box. I'm going to go ahead and just reset the tool to just be default settings. And it looks like I need an edge loop about right here, and I'll do another edge loop right about like so. I'm going to go ahead and grab all these verts, and I'm going to do the same thing where I hold Control. I'm going to widen this a little bit, and then look at the bottom. Looks like it should be a bit smaller. So now the leg just has a slight taper. I can go ahead and grab these faces. Notice how it's all 4 faces all around. Going to shift right click and do an extrude, and then I'm just going to kind of scale this in. And I think what I'll do is I'm going to grab both of these sort of face loops like so. Going to shift right click, do another extrude, and I can go ahead and use this little pop-up. So if I click and drag on this thickness, notice how you can actually make it go wider or smaller, and then you can use the offset kind of like so. Now that we have one leg, let's go ahead and deal with the top. So I'm going to go ahead, come over here. In this case, I'm just going to use this poly modeling, and I'm just creating a default cube. Now, right now, this leg is in perfect center of the scene. I will change that. But for now, what I want to do is figure out the width of this table. So I'm just going to do the same thing as I did before, where I hold Control, start scaling this. Notice how it's staying just as short, but it is getting wider in both directions. And I can go full frame. And I'm just aiming to kind of figure out the proper width of this table. So maybe about like so. In this case, since this image is in perspective, I'm looking more at this side. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit, and then I'm actually going to introduce this slight curve that I see. So to do that, I just need to grab this top face. I'm going to go ahead and extrude this up a tiny bit, bring this in, and then extrude this up a tiny bit again. So this is what I have going on. And this edge right here, I don't need this to be a hard edge. Right now, the normal is hard. So I'm going to double click this edge loop, come up here to mesh display, and I'm just going to do soften edge. So now notice if I deselect it, you don't see that hard edge kind of running through it. I'm going to go ahead and create one more cube. Now notice how I am using multiple cubes to make this. Ideally, whenever you model, what you want to do is kind of mimic how things are built in real life. So in real life, this top of the table is a separate piece of wood. This leg is a separate piece of wood. All of these additional pieces on the side are all separate pieces of wood. So because of that, I want to mimic the same thing. What I'm doing now is I am using both D and V to just kind of snap the geometry. And I'm just snapping it to some of these points just so that it is perfectly flush. And just like before, I can just start scaling it. I can deal with getting the exact position of each side of this later once I get all 4 legs in. Now I'm just kind of dealing with the sort of height of it. And since I don't actually know how thick this piece of wood is, I can just sort of guess. So maybe if I decide to do that, I think that would be pretty good. I do need to get this table centered to the grid now, as well as get some of these pieces centered and actually get this leg more appropriate to where it should be. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and add one more edge loop, and I'm going to add an edge loop in both directions of this, just so that I have a perfectly centered pivot on this geometry. So I'm going to use the insert edge loop tool again. So shift right click, insert edge loop tool, open up the dialog box. And in this case, I'm going to use this multiple edge loops and then change this number from 2 to 1. What this is going to allow me to do is if I click here, it doesn't matter where I click, it's going to make this edge loop go perfectly centered. So I'm just going to click it in both directions, and that gives me a perfect edge loop in both directions like so. And now that I have that, and I can go ahead and turn on wireframe, I can snap this over like so, and now I can actually start scaling this in this direction. I'm also going to go ahead and group this geometry. So just marquee select all this geometry, hit Control G, notice in the outliner how you get this group. And then what I want to make sure I do is move this pivot to the center of this geometry, because then I'm going to move the entire geometry back to center of the scene. Just like I have been doing, I'm going to hold D and V. Just going to grab this, snap to this point, snap to this point. I'm just making sure it's perfectly centered. I'm also just keeping it on the ground. That way, no matter what, the pivot stays on the bottom. If you accidentally move it, you can always snap this pivot down, up and down like so, and then you can snap it right like that. And then I can use the grid snapping and get it perfectly centered. Now that this is perfectly centered, I can deal with trying to get this leg a bit more appropriate to where it should be. So maybe like that. And then a pretty quick way to get this leg in all four positions. With this leg selected, I can just move the pivot to center. And now notice what happens if I rotate this rotate in Y by 90. It goes to that corner. If it's 180, it goes to the next one. And then 270 goes to the last one. So what I'm going to utilize is a duplicate special. A duplicate special is Shift D. Now I can hit 90 right here, hit enter. And now I can just hit Shift D again. It's automatically going to go to the third one, hit Shift D again, goes to the last one. I can do the same exact thing with this piece right here. So if I move the pivot right into the center, hit Shift D, rotate Y, 90, hit enter. Notice how it goes right there. I can go into X-ray view just so you can see this, Shift D and Shift D. And just like that, now we have this dining room table.